Signalis has got one of those weird, fucked up to wholesome ratios, which seems to make the darkest of games attract the friendliest of communities. If you've never heard of it before and think you're in for a cutesy time because of all the fan art, I have some very bad news for you. Signalis belongs to that category of sad horror games, which keep you scared at the start, and by the end, have you watching yourself try to stifle an ugly cry in the glossy blackness of your computer screen. It's also a very deep game, dealing with themes of political oppression, cosmic horror, guilt, loss, and what it means to be a person.
Who am I? What am I?
This survival horror game by German developer duo Rose Engine has a lot going on in it, and a lot to talk about. In this video, I'll be paying particular attention to the game's exploration of individuality and memory. I'll also discuss the many inspirations Signalis draws from other survival horror games, and the literature and art which informs Signalis' story. I'll also ramble on about other tangentially related subjects. See, like a lot of psychological horror games, Signalis really gets my brain going down these long, winding, ADHD-fueled pathways. It's about as chock full of things to try and wrap your brain around as it is fuel for its fans to pump out terabytes of Yuri.
It's called hentai, and it's art.
But we ought to start with the basics. Like my first trip on Psychoactives, we need to define the set and setting of the game. The set is lesbian depression. The setting is sci-fi East Germany. The events of Signalis take place against the backdrop of a declining imperial power and the rise of a dystopian spacefaring society. Following the death of the Empress, a revolutionary faction calling themselves the Yusin Nation broke away from the Empire in a violent war which left the star system fractured and the home planet of humanity devastated. The remaining humans, referred to as Gestalts, live and work alongside replicas, biomechanical humanoids modeled off of existing Gestalts, which serve as the specialized and expendable labor force of the nation. Think Blade Runner, but all the replicants are hot anime girls instead of looking like a narco-punk circus clowns. It's got that same 80s retrofuturism aesthetic too. We've got laser beams and space travel, but everything looks like it's being powered by North Korean computers. Even booting up the game is like booting up an old CRT monitor. The game's title screen fades in with a hum as the image tears and colors flash and freak out. And that big ol' eyeball in the main menu is just as much a symbol of surveillance as it is the peeper of our primary protagonist, LSTR-512, better known as Elster. Upon starting a new game, Elster awakens from her cryosleep to an empty spaceship. There's an ominous echo of clanking pipes and hissing gases sounding throughout the abandoned hull. Flashing red hazard lights cast her shadow across the cold sheet metal flooring, her stretched silhouette trailing each of her trepidatious steps forward. Alright, maybe I'm being too fanciful here. Signalis is rocking that low-poly PSX look, which has become more and more popular with indie horror games the past few years. I guess we all collectively moved on from the 8-bit nostalgia of the 80s into the pyramid-breasted, basketball-jointed, and pipe-cleaner-arm charm of the late 90s. It's a wonderful aesthetic for a horror game. The low detail level on character models and monsters provides enough information for the player to know what they're looking at, but leaves enough vagary to let their mind wander, and fill in the gaps with some imaginative creepiness. It's a trick which is doubly effective in a game like Signalis, where so much of the progression is tied to exploring the world and investigating its many mysteries, pushing the player to become more familiar with its uncanniness. Much of Signalis' story is presented through false documents. There's plenty of posters, memos, diary entries, that sort of stuff. And they all serve to provide some in-world justifications for game mechanics, as well as all the necessary lore needed to understand what's going on. The game could just tell us we're capable of healing ourselves with repair sprays, or pause the action and remind us to save our game, but that information is all presented diegetically instead. It makes the tutorialization feel more organic and less obtrusive, while encouraging you to pick the game's areas clean for any discarded notes which can solve a crucial puzzle. From poking around the ship, we can glean that we're on board the Penrose 512, an interstellar scout craft operated by a Gestalt and replica duo for the purposes of discovering new inhabitable or exploitable worlds. The trouble is, we've seemingly crash-landed on an alien planet, and our Gestalt pilot officer, Ariane Young, is nowhere to be found. The ship's cryopod is empty, and the mess hall's staff monitor can't get a signal on her whereabouts. With little choice but to explore outside of the ship, Elster heads to the airlock and suits up for the task ahead. We step out into the snow and pass through a black stone archway before approaching a big creepy hole in the ground. And as any well-adjusted horror protagonist would do, we go straight to the bottom before crawling through a meaty tunnel and finding ourselves within an old radio operator's room. It's all very surreal and should serve to temper your expectations for additional otherworldly bullshittery that's going to happen throughout the game. Inside is an old computer monitor, a chained-up safe, and a flag of the nation, which hangs alongside a pair of landscape photos where several old manuals and banned books can be seen nearby. The most sizzling bit of saucy reading in the room is, of course, The King in Yellow, the strange and magical fictional play from Robert W. Chambers' book of the same name. The foredge is bound by 6 black stone seals, and, like any good Eldritch artifact, The King in Yellow calls for us to pick it up. As we take up the tome, the nearby monitor crackles to life, flashing a series of numbers on the screen. Elster is bombarded with disjointed images of an icy outpost and a ghostly island. The tome reveals its secrets to her and warns her of the horrors her kind has unearthed on distant worlds, where ancient things were best left to lie undisturbed. Her body begins to die, and her synthetic flesh peels away, revealing the dark metal machinery beneath. In her glassy-eyed gaze, she beholds the truth. God damn! Honestly, this intro sequence is awesome. Probably one of the better first impressions a game has given me since Pathologic 2's Lynchian bovine wahey. Signalis has such a stylish aesthetic, and the visuals coupled with the rising intensity of Chopin's Raindrop Prelude evoke such strong feelings of mystery and melancholy that just hooked me the first time I saw it. Coming to moments later in a dingy bathroom is a little bit disorienting, sure, but fuck it. Weird shit's gonna happen, and we've all the motivation we need. A distant memory of a promise to be kept, and a photograph of our missing partner. Of course, finding her isn't gonna be easy. Hell, it took James the entire game before he realized he left his wife in the car. S-23 Sierpinski is a mining facility stationed on the frontier planet of Lang, owned and operated by the Yusin Nation and staffed by a Gestalt labor force supported by replica officers. Or at least, that's what the brochure sold us on. As it is now, Sierpinski is little more than a morgue. The bodies of dead replica workers lay scattered around the facility's darkened corridors, seemingly having succumbed to some kind of cancerous disease, which has bloated and disfigured their bioorganic components. Most of the Gestalts are presumed to be dead, having been sent down into the mines before the sickness began to spread. An injured star pattern security replica tells Elster that, while it is unlikely, taking the elevator downwards would be her best bet at finding her partner. Wait a minute, does she always have brown hair? Who the fuck is Alina? Though exploring Sierpinski isn't held up by clunky tank controls, Signalis otherwise plays like its PS1 influences. It's got that Resident Evil style health meter, item combining and inspecting, and resource management. Since Big Brother says we're only allowed to carry 6 items at a time, we also get a crate of holding in each save room to help manage our limited inventory space. Why and how did they settle on the number 6? I don't know, but get used to seeing that number a lot. Signalis also borrows many mechanics from the Silent Hill series. Exploration has that same checking doors off a list feeling. Levels initially start out pretty complicated, but dead ends and key items focus your attention and help you know where to look. There's plenty of visual and story similarities to Silent Hill as well, which I'll be drawing attention to at times for my own amusement and for your own annoyance. While things might start off pretty quietly, in typical horror game fashion, once you've got your hands on a gun, the game is ready to start throwing some shit at you. Those replicas who have been infected aren't quite as dead as they seem. The corpse we examined earlier is quick to spring into action, popping up with an eager shriek as Elster comes close, before chasing her with panicked, shambling steps down Sierpinski's hallways. At the end of the corridor, Elster comes across another survivor, a Gestalt named Issa. Like Elster, Issa is at Sierpinski looking for someone, a woman by the name of Erica, and though we disregard her warnings about pushing forward, she is ultimately understanding and empathetic, wishing us well before taking her leave. we should probably be worried about her, but then again, she did clap this replica pretty big time with that kitchen knife. The library Issa is in contains a microfilm viewer, which can be used to learn the combination to a safe within one of the classrooms. Using the keycard we find inside lets us open up the locked door connected to the aula, grab some supplies, open up the door, and dive down through the hole. From here on out, exploration becomes more open-ended. There are several other rooms to check, laid out in a less linear fashion than Sierpinski's starting floor, and plenty of puzzles to solve before we can get our hands on the ID card we need to operate the elevator that leads down into the mines. And naturally, we'll have to manage all of that while being chased by knife-wielding infected replicas in greater numbers. Though Signalis' enemies could be dismissed as some sort of amalgam of Silent Hill 2's nurses and the Rage virus infected from 28 Days Later, I nevertheless find this kind of body horror a perfect fit for the themes of individuality Signalis is exploring. The flesh-warped husks of the infected replicas are scary to me in the same way that zombies are. It's not so much about the being eaten thing, I mean that is part of it, as it is being absorbed by the mob. The horror of being turned into an empty shell of your former self, stripped of your identity and will, or that of seeing a loved one you know to be dead, and yet there they are, still walking around in a cruel parody of what you once so deeply admired. You may be able to tell what a replica enemy's original pattern was, but the person within it has been consumed by the spreading sickness. There's nothing of substance left, just hordes of these things now. The replicas of the facility are now little more than empty meat, devoid of any spirit or identity. In a way, it's the same horror which the dystopian Yusin nation promises to enact in the long term, a complete homogenization of its people into a single unthinking, unwaveringly loyal body, subservient to the goals of the state just as the infected replicas are subservient to their mad cravings for violence. The blood and butcher knives are just a more blatant expression of that same end. You'd think the chaos that has gripped the facility would supersede the Yusin nation's influence, but its ideological pressure can be felt just as much as the instinctual fear of being chopped up for taco meat. Most areas have a propaganda poster or two hanging around, and even with most of the staff dead, the facility's security cameras are all still powered on and set to record Elster's movements throughout the hallways. You really get the feeling that someone is always watching. Star even refuses to tell us any more about the facility due to her fear of being decommissioned. We're in a literal life or death crisis situation, but the politics of oppression seem a bigger threat to our characters than the literal mouth-breathing mass of flesh spreading throughout the facility. Hell, the only other remaining protectors don't even want to leave their offices, and Stalingrad-esque bullet rationing leaves little ammunition for us to work with. The more you look around, the more you learn about the Yusin nation's politics, and its all-encompassing grip over society. Just when you've gotten over the rule of sixes, limiting your inventory space like the women's fashion industry, you'll come across a memorandum from the facility's administrator, Adler, announcing the retirement and replacement of specific terminology, which leaves Sierpinski's first floor nameless. The area's name is even censored when you're saving your game, which is a bit meta, sure, but if the save system is intended to be a part of an in-world display on Elster's monitor, then this update has already been downloaded into her brain before we've even read about it. The creation of a perfect world in a perfect language all has a very Orwellian ring to it, and while the nation has taken efforts to censor anything which might betray the real purpose of this place, there are enough contextual clues around for us to hazard a guess. After all, I can't think of many reasons why a mining facility would need one-way mirrors, classrooms, and military police. For my fellow Helldivers, we'd call this place a freedom camp. For those of you that touch grass on occasion, the upper floors of Sierpinski are used as a re-education facility, a giant gulag in outer space which serves to correct the worldviews of its prisoners, putting them to work in the mines under the armed supervision of protector replicas. The floors below are structured like a prison complex. The worker habs are organized into blocks, and each unit consists of a set of bunks which look like chain-link Japanese sleeping pods. There's a large cafeteria and several kitchens for feeding a large group of people, as well as a communal shower. The facility being a prison complex would also explain the kinds of equipment we can find lying around. Pistols and stun prods are more suited to putting down a riot than they are the slaying of marinara murder monsters. There's also an evidence lockup, though judging by the note in the office, most of the items taken from workers seem to be personal effects. Jewelry, medication, a pen, and a locked makeup box, originally belonging to one Alina Sieđ, the woman in Elster's new photograph who bears a striking resemblance to Ariane Young. In order to make progress, we have to find the two halves of Alina's makeup box key, and bring them back to the storage closet to unlock the chest and find an item. The Plate of Eternity. Picking up the artifact flashes an image of an ancient door, and a writhing wall of flesh, before we once again find ourselves transported elsewhere, this time to Radio Station 6, on the snowy planet of Rotfront. There's a letter on the table addressed to Iris Young, Ariane's mother. It would seem that in her youth, Ariane lived with her mother in this radio station before being transferred to the city to live with her Aunt Camilla and receive a normal education. Since the same banned Imperial cereals from the prologue can be seen on a shelf nearby, we can assume Ariane's mother was a bit more open-minded than her more indoctrinated sister. And that room we were in was probably Ariane's after she moved away to live with Camilla, having brought with her some of her mother's things. On the desk nearby, Elster can find a replica radio module, introducing a new gameplay element within her status screen. The radio module opens up several frequencies Elster can tune into for the purpose of solving various puzzles throughout the game. Using the radio module by the structure outside unlocks its door and allows Elster to return to the evidence lockup back in Sierpinski. Fresh out of one fever dream and back into the old, though still mysteriously in possession of the radio module she found on Rotfront. Now that she's back, we can use that radio module to receive a transcription of several secret codes, which open up the locked wall safe containing the ID card we need to access the elevator. Once inside, we can either head back up to the floor we came from, or descend deeper into Sierpinski. If we take the elevator up to the first floor, we'll find Isa. She's still alive and well, and honestly, considering the things we've had to go through to get this far, she seems to be handling herself pretty well with that kitchen knife. The rest of the doors on this floor are otherwise locked or too jacked up to be opened again, which leaves only the lower floors left to explore. At least it would if the elevator didn't crap out on floor 3 and eat our ID card. We end up in Sierpinski's hospital section, where we can expect the numerous replicas who met their end within its wards to rise again, with the singular purpose of giving us a bad time. The documents scattered around this area provide us with insights surrounding the infection and a timeline of its development. Patients first report nausea and headaches before succumbing to fever and internal bleeding. Within a few days, large patches of skin begin to peel off the body as cognitive function declines and severe alopecia sets in. It's all very reminiscent of severe radiation poisoning. For Gestalts, this usually means death by the 5th day, but for the infected replicas, it's hard to say just how long their suffering was prolonged, or if it even ever ended, what with the whole getting back up after death thing. From this point on, any enemies Elster kills will be able to revive after enough time has passed. A memorandum distributed throughout the hospital warns of this behavior, which staff members had begun to observe in the dead bodies of infected protectors. The notes paint a grim picture, suggesting a casualty rate too high for the facility's 2-oven crematorium to keep up. And though they're no longer in use, we can't exactly start dragging bodies to the bakery every time we need to dispose of a corpse. But we can improvise, and use some of the thermite flares found around the hospital, which burn hot enough to melt through a replica's exoskeleton in order to destroy the flesh underneath. The thermite flares will prevent any enemies we kill from getting back up, but they're rare to come by, and as such, should be saved for tougher enemies we really don't want to have to deal with again, or for the clearing out of rooms which we're likely to pass through frequently when backtracking. And we're gonna be doing a lot of backtracking. The central feature on this floor is a familiar-looking security door in the waiting room, which leads to Sierpinski's surgery room and requires 5 separate keycards to open. Each key is located somewhere within the hospital, and each requires its own related puzzle to be solved before it can be obtained. In rather punny fashion, the air, fire, water, and earth keys can each be found in an air duct, the crematorium, the flooded pipe room, and inside of a chunk of stone, respectively. The 5th key needed to open the way forward is distinct, both in that gold is not a classical element, and that the key is found outside of Sierpinski and Elster's current reality. Elster can grab a video cassette from the sleeping ward and use the VCR located elsewhere within the hospital to enter the recording, yes, enter the recording, and procure the last item. At the back of an empty train car, our familiar white-haired pilot officer Ariane waits with a longing look on her face. Monolithic apartment complexes fly past, the light from their many windows intruding upon her solitude like prying, judgmental eyes. As if leaving us the means to progress, she disappears with the flickering of the lights above her, and leaves behind the gold key, inscribed with a special motif, a capital letter A. With the 5 keys in hand, the way to the surgery room is open. Inside, there are several additional supplies strewn about, as well as a chest to allow us to reorganize after loading up our government-mandated pockets with keycards. In dropping down into the room below, we arrive at Signalis' first boss fight against Mina, a heavy industrial specialist replica whose name incidentally sounds like Carmela Soprano saying the word minor. I've talked a bit about Signalis' similarities to Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and those influences can be felt yet again with this encounter. Mina's tall Dami-Mami aesthetic reminds me of RE8's Dimitrescu if she was wearing a mid-19th century diving suit. And the overall flow of the fight is much like a Silent Hill game, which unfortunately invokes a less entertaining feeling and instead makes the whole experience border on frustrating. If Signalis could have left one thing from Silent Hill alone, it should have been the boss fights, man. It's kind of my only complaint about the game, really. The entire encounter boils down to standing behind one of 2 objects while Mina dumps round after round of her mining laser into various obstructions, before having a bout of nausea thinking about her own game mechanics and allowing us to plug her with a few 10mm rounds until the fight is over. When you finally put the big girl down, you'll be introduced to Sierpinski's administration-type replica, Adler. I'll point out now that he's the only character in the game whose name is written in yellow, for no particular reason whatsoever. Adler is unusually calm considering the state of Sierpinski. He seems to know about Alina, her position within the facility, and potentially even her whereabouts. But before Elster can get any information out of him, Adler unceremoniously pushes her down the open elevator shaft to her apparent death. I guess we shouldn't have come back, but it's not like I had a choice, right? Wait a minute, have we done this before? We cut to a flashback with Issa, who awakens in an empty school classroom. Snow falls over the darkened cityscape, the brutalist buildings looming in the dark in front of great radar dishes pointed skyward, a symbol of the Yusin nation's reach. The high school's moonlit halls carry the distant sounds of sobs, giggles, and taunts. Peering through the crack in the library doors, Issa spies several masked students teasing and physically abusing a young Ariane. It's no wonder her later train rides home were a lonely and depressing affair. Feelings of inferiority would cripple her sense of self-worth, and her unusual physical appearance would only serve to alienate her from forming real personal connections with the vast majority of students. Following this flashback, Elster awakens on the 5th floor of the Protector Barracks, her fall having been cushioned by a veritable mound of long-dead replicas. It would seem Adler's been 300 booting Elsters down this hole for quite some time, though our Elster doesn't seem particularly fazed. The areas open to us are patrolled by a gaggle of infected replicas, both old and new. The familiar worker drone Eulers are supported by riot shield-bearing stars which once called these dormitories home. Additionally, several corrupted Calibri pattern replicas can be found en masse in the 7th floor management office, amplifying their discordant emotions and causing significant damage to Elster over time until the correct counter frequency is tuned into. Elsewhere, Issa approaches the facility commander's room and is confronted by Adler, his hollow, honeyed words barely masking his violent intentions. Adler's been making it his business to deal with the pair of outsiders personally, turning his attention to Issa after believing Elster to be dead after her fall. He really should have known better. Everyone knows if you don't see the body, they're not dead, right? Throughout the lower floors of the middle and upper classes, several envelopes containing classified information can be found, their seals tantalizingly broken. Most of these documents contain schematics and other related information regarding the purpose and function of various replica patterns. We're more than familiar with the worker pattern Euls and security pattern stars that have been trying to club us to death. As for the new radio jacking Calibris we've encountered earlier, their abilities seem to stem from something called bioresonance, a kind of psychic aptitude which allows the Calibri pattern replicas to communicate telepathically. The documentation also contains known issues regarding these replicas, detailing the typical patterns of behavior exhibited by certain models. For every replica, there is a subset of stabilizing factors consisting of actions or objects which serve to prevent a replica from experiencing what is known as persona degradation, which is defined as the resurfacing of a replica's original Gestalt memories and the subsequent development of their own sense of selfhood. These stabilizing factors vary based on the replica model. While some of these can at times read like an Idolmaster biography, the behaviors replicas exhibit, and the fetishes they covet, have a firm link to the original memories of the Gestalt they were patterned off of, before they were given the old Russian oligarchy defenestration special. Progressing through the 8th floor, we reach the same room Adler confronted Issa in earlier. On a table in the lobby, an overview of the Falca Pattern Commander Unit describes it as a powerful bioresonant authority figure, whose strength of presence and resemblance to the nation's revolutionary leaders lead others to treat her with a level of reverence fit only for the divine. Though in her current state, she is really rather pitiable. A comatose psychic false god interred in her bedroom and barely kept alive by life support systems. I wonder where I've seen that before. On the seat by her bed is Falca's personal diary, an ominous and worn-looking thing patterned in red ink with recursive triangles and overbearing eyes. At some point prior to her first entry, Falca had gone down into the mines and discovered something, which she describes as a red eye beyond the gate. Some unknowable phenomenon had poisoned her mind, robbing it of her memories and overwriting them with another's. Half herself and half a stranger, Falca's every waking moment would be gripped by an obsessive desire to understand what she saw, the white-haired girl for whom she feels such deep longing for. After leaving Falca's bedroom, we finally make our way to Adler's office, which is a rather ill-kept place considering he was in charge of the facility's administration. I don't know, maybe it went to shit after he did. On his desk, Elster can find Adler's diary. Within its bindings, Adler details his dreams and resurfacing memories of his Gestalt life, clearly alluding to his advancing case of persona degradation. He also makes mention of a peculiar piece of furniture that had been confiscated from one of the workers, likely a Gestalt who had found the artifact down in the mines and attempted to keep it for themselves. Adler would keep himself busy tinkering away with the box, which he would come to understand as being a kind of clockwork astronomical calendar. The box in question sits on the table nearby. The primary mechanism, having been removed, leaves naught but an empty socket upon its face. Returning to the library, Elster can interact with a kind of book vending machine in order to obtain a copy of The King in Yellow, which contains within its hollowed-out body an astrolabe, which sockets perfectly into Adler's mystery box. I would have preferred a flask of scotch, but here we are. The astrolabe acts as a kind of star chart, each ring representing an orbit which corresponds to one of the star system's 6 worlds. A holographic view of the system can be examined within this floor's briefing room, providing a glimpse at the space beyond Sierpinski, as well as the correct orientation for the astrolabe puzzle. Tangentially, I find the names of Signalis' planets really rather interesting. Buyan, Veneta, and Sieģ, the 3 innermost planets, each derive their names from cities and islands of Russian and Baltic myth. The Russian myth of the city of Buyan describes the place as the location of the secrets of immortality, which Signalis references with its immortal empress, at least once thought of as undying before her suicide. The city of Veneta was said to have been sunk as a result of the hedonistic and blasphemous lifestyles of its inhabitants, mirroring Signalis' Veneta having been destroyed in a war waged by an ignorant and arrogant humanity at odds with itself. Sieģ, basically Russian Atlantis, was said to have sunk into the lake to defend its inhabitants from the Golden Horde. When interacting with the holographic orrery, Elster makes mention of the Imperial blockades around the planet, thematically tying the strength of the Imperial fleet to the Mongol armies which beset the Sieģ of myth. Historical and literary references and inspirations can be found within the remaining 3 worlds as well. Rotfront, the location of the Usen Nation's major cities, derives its name from the Rotfront's Kampfverbund, which was a far-left paramilitary organization active during the Weimar Republic. We've seen glimpses of Rotfront in the train car and classroom flashbacks. Its brutalist architecture and openly displayed propaganda posters are emblematic of the political extremism and militarism which characterize the Rotfront's Kampfverbund. The Usen Nation's capital world Heimat has a similarly uniquely German connection. The word can be translated into English as home or homeland, but it has some nuances specific to German culture which are lost in translation. Not to get too philosophical or anything, I ain't no Natalie, but existentially speaking, Heimat provides an individual with a community with which to identify, and a set of expectable actions and reasonable expectations which provide a person with a safe space within which to manifest their ideas and shape the world around them. Said community allows its subjects to receive recognition from and confer recognition upon one another, validating their individuality and selfdom. The sad irony is that the Heimat of the Yusin nation stands in stark contrast to this Hegelian ideal, creating a community which stifles individuality instead of allowing it to flourish. This twisting of the term within Signalis' lore is similar to the real-world history of Heimat, which has some pretty thorny associations with Nazi Germany. During the 19th century, the migration of German people from rural to urban areas during the Industrial Revolution created a sort of widespread feeling of unfamiliarity and nostalgia. This idea of a patriotic attachment to one's homeland was later easily twisted by Adolf Hitler's rhetoric into the concepts of blood and soil and Lebensraum, as part of the greater body of fascist mythology being cultivated at that time. This pining for the good old days served to attract large masses of voters who had become disillusioned with traditional politics, promising them a brighter future and a rebirth of the nation for the true people. I don't want to be too political here, but the final planet, Leng, which serves as the home for S-23 Sierpinski, finds its origins within the works of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, not as a planet, but as an otherworldly plateau, which serves as a kind of crossroads between various realities. Leng's orbit is one of the furthest from the Sun, placing it within the darkest reaches of the star system. And since it does not appear to be orbiting a parent planet, it's possible that Leng aligns with Pluto, or other dwarf planets and small bodies which make up the Kuiper Belt. Then again, it may fail to match up with any planet of the solar system, further emphasizing just how alien and out of place Leng is. Hey, remember that episode of the Magic School Bus where Arnold fucking commits to win an argument? Planetary tangents aside, returning to Adler's study with an eidetic module snapshot of the orrery, or a Steam screenie if you're too lazy to run back to the save room, allows us to set the dial to its correct configuration and open the mysterious shrine-like box. Contained within is the administrator keycard which we will need to access the mines, as well as a book, which Adler has put to use as his second diary. The diary holds several entries, all of which share the same date and describe Adler's growing paranoia and sense of déjà vu. Yesterdays that never were are recalled with increasing intensity. The man is living in a Groundhog Day hell and is being slowly driven mad by the knowledge that he is reliving the same day over and over again. Only this time, Punxsutawney slips further and further into chaos with each passing cycle. His understanding of the incident would grow as he pieced together his disjointed memories, the influence of this artifact found below granting him insights into the recursive reality Sierpinski became trapped in. Slowly, the calls from below would begin to sound out, luring him into those eldritch depths from which the corruption first emerged. Having resolved to discover the truth, Adler descended and began searching for answers within the same mine which crippled his commander. The very same mine we must now delve into in the hopes of finding the one we came for. In the darkness below, Adler hounds after Issa with rifle in hand, focusing his killing intent and intimate knowledge of previous cycles and calmly looking to snuff the remaining anomaly from his waking nightmare. But Issa is an outsider absent from the memories of yesterday's past, her whereabouts and actions unable to be determined until far too late. She plunges her knife into Adler's right eye and sends him plummeting down into the depths below. Since we're fresh out of that last tangent, I'll let this on-screen flash of Zyklus slide. For now. With her elevator ride coming to an end, Elster braces for the mines and steps out into the mysterious stony expanse. There's no sign of any Gestalt survivors, which doesn't bode well for Elster's search, but there are a few uncorrupted replicas to be found within the mine. Down a side passage, a disabled miner replica can be found slumped against a wall, her hydraulics damaged, and judging by the pool of oxidant she's sitting in, her time running short. She introduces herself as Bio, offering some advice and direction to help Elster's search. Bio is an interesting individual. Beyond being wholesome AF and breaking my heart, she's the only replica in the game which introduces herself with a name that does not correspond to her physical make and model, implying that Bio is actually her given name, or more specifically, the given name of her original Gestalt. She's a pretty old gal by her own admission, and has likely had more than enough time since the incident kicked off to undergo persona degradation and a resurgence of old memories. She tells us not to worry about her and reminds Elster that all replicas are expendable, but there's a distinct hesitation in her speech. She doesn't seem to be trying to console us so much as she is trying to convince herself that her death is meaningless. and she very well may have believed that for a time. Minas are noted for being particularly stable in unproblematic patterns, and she likely fully bought into the Yusin Nation's ideology without a worry up until this point. But now, with her frame disabled and lifeblood fleeing her veins, Bio has to come to terms with the reality of non-existence. She is a unique person, with unique experiences and a life to call her own which stands to be lost after her death. Sure, the nation can whip up another Mina with the same base pattern as her, but their lives will be completely different, and their memories and experiences will ultimately culminate in the formulation of two very distinct subjects. It's that Roy Batty shit, you know? Her heightened sense of individuality and clarity surrounding her death may even be a result of the life review phenomenon. Only in her case, the life flashing before her very eyes is that of her original gestalts. The star pattern replica we met earlier in the game, now mortally wounded, seems to be undergoing the same kind of terminal lucidity as Bio, having recalled her name from her old life as she lays dying. And yet still she pines for her own memories, wishing once more to see the stars with her lover, whom she now seeks to comfort with thoughts of an afterlife. The seeking of solace in a metaphysical fantasy is a really human coping mechanism. I mean, she's a robot. She shouldn't need to tell herself or any replica this stuff, but somewhere down the line from her original patterning, she's come to cultivate a rich body of personal emotions and experiences, which make her more than just a machine of the nation. These two NPC encounters slot perfectly into the introduction for Chapter 2. With little more than silence and the occasional gaggle of easily juked mobs down here, there's plenty of time to think about this kind of shit. Star's deathbed confessions are just so raw, and Bio's kindness in the face of her own death is like a punch to the gut. I really wish I could just be there for her, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm coming off as overly sensitive or pretentious. I'm certainly not trying to be. Heck, I'm one of the first to bat a skeptical eye at most abstract art. This is kinda just what Signalis does to you after a while. The entire experience is so surreal and so steeped in dreadful emotions that I can't help but try and look for a meaning to it all, even if, in all likelihood, there simply isn't one. And that's really what life is about, isn't it? I suppose one can always resign from seeking purpose and free themselves from that worry, but surely it's a more noble pursuit to try and extract even just a fleeting moment of beauty from our brief time alive, before those memories of starry skies and sharing a drink and some music with a loved one are lost to time, like tears in rain. I understand a lot of this might be getting particularly heavy out of nowhere, so here are some funny words to lighten the mood. Poo, clunge, wank, tit, dick, smeg, and fart. After one last push into the mines and a brief rope-a-dope segment, Elster reaches the fathomless drop Issa sent Adler careening down moments earlier, the gaping pit's lip still slick with his blood. A distant lapping of waves can be heard below, and with nowhere else to go, you guessed it, we take a dive deep down into the unknown. After our fall, we're hit with another mysterious recollection, which opens up on our exit from some rocky tunnel. Motes of dust float down to the beach from a copper sky overlooking the Black Sea below. A singular star looms on the horizon, piercing through the thick veil of clouds which cling to the night like dried blood. Light crests over the cliffs above, but no moon nor sun can be seen in this alien landscape. The first-person perspective, coupled with the square aspect ratio, makes for a simultaneously personal and claustrophobic experience, like we're witnessing an anxious memory. Across the sands, several tattered pages bear faded words upon their faces, but the passages are too damaged to make out in full, save for one note. It calls me, in a sea of flesh. We will become one, but I can never go back to being me. In a small nook in the cliffs, the King in Yellow can be spied through the narrow gap lying just out of reach, 3 of its original seals having been broken. Feels like it's taunting us at this point. Turning towards the distant shore of oblivion, the vision fades, and we awaken at the bottom of the hole, ankle-deep in rust water and surrounded by the glassy-eyed frames of several dead replicas. At least this place ain't no shit pit, but what it is isn't exactly clear. It's got the same brutalist architecture we've seen in the floors above, but all of the fixins are corroded and worn, and the doorways, looming cage-like, are caked in rust. This somewhere is, in fact, nowhere, a mysterious plane of existence which mirrors, or perhaps lays bare, the real world. It looks a lot like the other world of the Silent Hill games, an alternate, similarly mapless dimension which appears throughout the series. But it also looks a lot like Signalis. The rooms down here and our progression through them, coupled with the decaying aesthetic, make nowhere feel like someone's faded memories of the game. The ladder we take further downwards resembles the central ladder on the Penrose. There's rusted classrooms reminiscent of Sierpinski's re-education facility, the hallway from the Yule dormitories, and the silhouette of a person on a concrete slab framed in the same way as Falca was in her bedroom. But there's also all kinds of other rooms here we've never seen before, like this shrine room or this museum showroom from hell. Seriously, what is this place supposed to be, the bloody bathtub exhibit? And none of it makes any sense. You'll take a door on the left side of the screen and come right back out on the same side somewhere else. Look at this fan-made map of the area. It's got nonsensical door as part of the legend. Everything's so scrambled and chaotic. It's more like the faded memories of multiple people smashed into one, merged together in a sea of flesh. Oh god, oh fuck! How far-reaching is this cycle? Are we even the first people to come across this place? Before heading down the first ladder, there's a faded warning sign. It's all in pixely German, and most of it's rusted away, but the few legible fragments of the translation show a clear resemblance to long-term nuclear waste warning messages. These warnings exist as a way to deter human intrusion at nuclear waste sites, and incorporate simple and direct language and symbols to drive the point home. Bad vibes, stay away, you will die. Seeing as it's written in German, it probably hasn't been 10,000 years or anything, but someone has definitely been here before. Or at least has been to whatever place that has now become one with the flesh. But hey, those wards on Tutankhamun's tomb didn't stop the Brits, and no stupid sign is gonna stop us. Not content with snatching Silent Hill's aesthetics and mechanics, this boss fight also directly takes after the flesh lips in Silent Hill 2's Brookhaven Hospital. It's mostly an exercise in kiting and popping off shots whenever you get a comfortable distance away from Legsy. After enough time, Issa composes herself and takes aim, nearly taking off Elster's head while knocking herself out with the recoil, but ultimately landing the killing blow on the boss. It'd be wrong to just leave her, so Elster picks her up and takes her to a save room down here, which looks about as cozy as the inside of a raw cut of tenderloin. Upon examining the rifle, it's easy to see why she was blasted off her feet. The thing's practically firing tree trunks. Elster can find some smelling salts in the area above and use them to wake Issa up. She thanks Elster for her help and lets us take the rifle for our troubles, before laying back down to get some rest and letting us take our exit. We're not gonna get out of here standing around now, are we? There's been plenty of foreshadowing and imagery about it before this, but the notes and puzzles around nowhere are fully leading into the whole cyclical story revelation thing. Most of the key items are behind locked doors marked with shapes. In another room, there's an oscilloscope which reacts to Elster's radio module. The device draws a shape on screen when the right radio frequency is played, providing the correct keypad combo for the corresponding door. Remember when I said I'd get back to Zyklus? Well, haha, it's time! Wait, where did everybody go? Zyklus, meaning cycle, is a musical composition written to be played by one percussionist using various instruments. Regardless of the performer's starting point and chosen direction through the score, they'll ultimately loop through the notes and end up back at the beginning, with continued play taking on a cyclical sound. I mean, to my musically illiterate ears, it's all noise, but I'm sure music nerds would gush over this kind of thing. And if our starting point is the Penrose, then nowhere can be seen as the end of our cycle. I don't think it's any coincidence that we're shown this image after Adler gets yeeted into Fleshtown. Like Zyklus, the shapes needed for Nowhere's puzzles are cyclical. They can be drawn without lifting one's pencil and can be completed from any starting point. In addition, several of these shapes are depicted as impossible objects, most notable of them being the Penrose Triangle, which also serves as the icon for the game's executable file. It was right there the whole time. I mean, heck, it's the name of the ship we came in on where we first confirmed the cycle, and there's been visual nods to the idea hidden all over the place. And it's not just the shapes. The game's got us running around collecting Matryoshka dolls and rings for the remaining puzzles. Everything down here is layers, loops, and cycles, and all the while we're being chased by familiar horrors down familiar corridors, all culminating in our arrival at a familiar door, the one shown to us when we first found the Plate of Eternity. The room itself is nearly identical to the door into surgery before we fought Mina, save for all the cages and flesh, of course. Believe me, Elster, I'm right there with you. With the 6 plates slotted in, the door opens, and on the other side of it, the end of our cycle. We ascend from that same great hole we first found dug out of Rotfront's pores, only now Lovecraft's quotation has a more literal meaning. Up above, black basalt columns form a staircase against a stark red background. Adler rests at the base of the archway at the top, bloodied and still empty from Falka's absence. Physically, he's been here countless times before, but psychologically, he's never returned from his first visit to these eldritch depths. This threshold is the one Falka wrote about, wherefrom she became the first of the infected, and wherein her former self was irrevocably changed. It's impossible to tell what could be beyond it, but there's nothing else for it now. There is only the way forward. Beyond the red gate, a sunless red desert stretches into infinity. Great stone pillars rise out of the lone and level sands. Nothing beside remains. There is only emptiness. A place such as this should not exist. Not anywhere, least of all under a mine. It is a realm of impossibility from which surely none can return unaltered. But this was never about me. It was always us. Whatever or whoever us is. The Isles of the Dead flash within our mind, the piecing together of knowledge never meant to be beheld by mortal eyes. Revelations which have doomed us in times before this, and will in times afterwards. Our dead selves slump against the pillars, each a headstone bearing the mark of the cycle. Be not afraid. Beyond them, the sleeping hull of the Penrose 512, its buried frame now little more than a tomb. Why are we here? Who is waiting for us? The oarsman draws closer now. As life ebbs, clarity returns. Visions of a past we've never lived. Voices of people we've only met in our minds. The breaking down of what makes us real. Arousing from a dream about being a person. But we've been sleepwalking long enough. It is time to awaken. And with realization comes pain. Be not afraid. A second voice calls through the void. A flood of foreign memories invade us, remaking us. Visions of attack ships in Venetian skies, flames licking at the walls of the ruined cityscape. Dust, blood, death. Home. We remember. We've come back. No, we've never left. I'm awake now. The hatch is stuck. Our body is weak. What little strength we've left to muster is not enough. Crashing down that colossal wreck, limbless and alone in the wastes. Is this what it's all amounted to? I'm sorry. I'm tired now. Sleep comes over me. Our vision fades, and with it, our promise. We failed. Yeah, this is about the time I ended up staring at my teary-eyed self in the monitor. It's also about the time I sat back, mouth agape, wondering what the fuck just happened. This ending is pretty dense, and honestly, a lot of it is probably lost on me. I know there's plenty of references sprinkled through it to Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey and Hideaki Anno's Neon Genesis Evangelion, the latter of which I've embarrassingly never seen. I know, you can revoke my nerd card now, I'm a fucking phony. I also know that a lot of people saw these references as a bit too on the nose. To me, none of this was an issue, but I could see how Signalis could be seen as relying a bit too heavily on leveraging the preconceived notions of its inspirations to convey its message in this ending. I think I have that issue more with the game's overall silent hilliness, but then again, I'm far more familiar with those games than the films and anime Signalis borrows from, so maybe I just notice it more. Still, there's enough going on in this ending that it could probably make for an entire video of its own. Really, it's likely that video already exists and I just haven't seen it. You'd probably do well to search through the subreddits or through other Signalis content on YouTube to find that sort of thing if you're interested. But for the purposes of our discussion, I'll provide my own interpretations of the images and their meaning within Signalis' story. And the key, I think, to understanding it all is with this painting. This ending is primarily about Elster remembering who she is, or was. Much like Bio, there's a kind of clarity which accompanies the death she's walking into, and the images of Arnold Böcklin's Isle of the Dead and various shots of past lives suggest that through a combination of persona degradation and bio-resonant eldritch whackery, Elster is waking up, so to speak. Arnold Böcklin's painting, the one we see flash before us, and the one we've seen several times throughout the game, was described by Böcklin himself as a dream picture, a work of immersive stillness, which lulls its beholder with an aura of solemn silence. The game was even advertised as sleepwalking through a half-remembered dream, so this verbiage is very much intentional. Notably, Arnold Böcklin produced 5 different versions of his painting, with each modifying the island's landscape ever so slightly, much like how memories mutate with each recollection and future telling. Further still, in every rendition, the oarsman is no closer to the island's shores. Each painting is an iteration of a cycle which cannot be escaped, the grief of the passengers frozen in time as they vainly paddle on to a relief which will remain ever beyond their grasp. The painting's 5 versions also correspond to the 5 Elsters that have passed beyond the threshold, the 4 that lay dead by the pillars, and our own Elster, making this the final lap of the cycle, so to speak. We're also shown Jürgen Bracht's The Shore of Oblivion, a painting which is closely related to Böcklin's in its themes of death and isolation in German culture, and which also served as the visual inspiration for the beach sequence from earlier. As the paintings are associated with one another, they're often hung up together throughout the game. Most of the text on screen that calls out to Elster would be the voice of Ariane, psychically reaching out to Elster and drawing her in towards the Penrose. This voice asks her 2 main questions: who are you, and why are you here? Up until this point, Elster has believed herself to be a replica, stationed on S-23 Sierpinski looking for a Gestalt by the name of Alina Sieđ. When the memories of her Gestalt life flooded her mind, Elster recalled her time on Veneta as a soldier, where she sustained an injury to her eye during the conflict, later holding out in a bombed-out trench after the chaos of combat settled around her. This same woman is pictured as standing next to Alina Sieđ, a member of her unit that fought on Veneta. It's the same photograph we've had since the start of the game, only after the introduction, Elster started seeing Alina instead of Ariane, and believed herself to be looking for her partner from her Gestalt life. As Ariane calls out to her, she begins to awaken and understand that Alina and Elster's Gestalt are likely long dead, and the woman she's looking for is instead our white-haired Gestalt pilot whom Elster confused for Alina. This is what Ariane is referring to when she asks Elster to wake up, to see past the dreams of her Gestalt life and return to Ariane's side in order to fulfill their promise, whatever it may be. And so the Elster we've been playing this entire time probably isn't the same Elster we went through the prologue as. The Elsters all turning in line are Elsters of different cycles. We could even see the one in the middle missing her arm already, and the one in front of her wearing the spacesuit from the prologue. So any other playthroughs we may have started, and died during, would just be other Elsters. But they've likely had their memories slowly overwritten by Ariane. The original template for their patterns was clearly already unstable, considering they had memories of their Gestalt lives. But in a twist, Signalis flips the degradation the other way around. Our Elster needs to remember her replica life, her life as Ariane's Elster. Unfortunately, Ariane's original Elster died ages ago, and Ariane's been brainjacking other models ever since in order to overwrite their memories. The titles of the game's 2 chapters seem to reflect this idea. Synchronicity is in reference to the synchronization of our Sierpinski Elster with Ariane and her memories of her Elster, and Liminality is an anthropological concept used in the context of a religious rite of passage, referring to the threshold between 2 stages of development. in Elster's case, the entering of nowhere and the state in which she has lost her former self, but has not yet begun to be overwritten by Ariane. How Ariane is able to rewrite a person's memories is left vague, but it's already been alluded to by one of Alina's diary entries that can be found in Nowhere. Her final note ends by stating that her hair is turning white, and she's slowly beginning to remember a name and life she's never lived, the line between her and the stranger blurring with each passing day. Like the many Elsters turning when their name is called, Alina is seen at the back of the line which responds to the name Ariane. At the head of that line is Falca. She too was slowly being overwritten by Ariane, growing more and more obsessed with the white-haired woman as her illness progressed. Seems she wanted to find Ariane just as badly as Elster wanted to find Alina. Could Falca be remembering Elster's life as Ariane's replica through Ariane? Oh my god, my brain is imploding. There's just so much going on in this ending. It'd be a brutal undertaking to cover it all, and I'm not even sure I'm coherently explaining any of it right now. There's a lot to analyze, and as I've said before, plenty of fuel for fans to speculate on the meaning of the game's plot and overall story. But the beautiful thing to me is that this scene works in spite of being so convoluted. You don't really have to get what's going on to be affected by it. It's such a phenomenal and moving experience. The art style is so bold and beautiful, and the track by one of the game's composers, 1000 Eyes, titled Die Toteninsel, incidentally the German name for Arnold Böcklin's painting, is enough to move me to tears all its own. It's a phenomenal ending to a wonderful game, which genuinely moves me every time I experience it. It's also a complete fucking lie! The game is fucking lying to you! Alright, I'll be real. Rose Engine had me in the first half. The first time I played Signalis and got to this point, I sat back in my seat equal parts emotional and confused, and spent a good few minutes staring slack-jawed and ape-like at the game's title screen, which the game kindly boots you to after the credits roll. Elster's eye, which I had become so accustomed to, no longer followed my cursor, and something was clearly off with all the glitchiness. Still, I hit quit and got ready to head for bed, before the game started back up again at the beginning. At least, sort of. Elster boots back up on the Penrose, only this time the ship is still in flight. All systems are nominal, and the flashing everything's gone to shit lights are off. It's a stark change from the fleshy hell of Nowhere. Everything's back to being familiar and safe again. We've got our map screen back, a clear set of instructions on what to do on our routine maintenance checks, and most importantly, we've got fucking Colibri. Yeah, dude, this doodle makes me so happy. Every time I play through this game, it still manages to get a chuckle out of me, despite the past 5 hours of panicked running, tedious boss fights, philosophical quackery, and incredibly confusing story reveals, culminating in a full run-through of the game's credits after a fake-out ending. It's just so great. On our way to completing our various systems checkups, there's plenty of other stuff to explore around the Penrose. We get to play through an average day on the ship and see what Elster and Ariane's lives were like before the agony. There's some faxed documents lying about which provide a little more background on the Penrose's mission, and some paintings by Ariane, as well as her personal notes. They make mention of Elster and Ariane's playful, friendly relationship, as well as Ariane's disregard for the documentation the Usad Nation provided to her as pilot officer. There's a sealed envelope containing known faults for the Elster replica, much like the documents regarding other replicas we've seen earlier. The document confirms that Elster's neural pattern was derived from the Venetian soldier we saw in the false ending, and that conversations, photographs, and movies about the war can contribute to destabilization. Boy, it's a good thing they haven't been watching Come and See and making merry all this time. Oh. So, yeah, if there's any doubt as to what caused Elster's persona degradation to make her think Ariane was Alina, their time on the Penrose together ought to dispel that. The two have clearly developed a pretty intimate relationship with one another. On the night of their 3000 cycle anniversary, the two share a dance to one of Ariane's favorite songs, which can also be heard in the background of her mother's home. On its surface, it's a touching moment. The two are to receive their new orders soon, and they've been going steady for some time now. It's always nice to see a happy young couple. Ariane's diaries are written with an innocent, even naive voice, which makes it all the more sweet, even if it's a bit on the YA side. She's all alone out here, and fallen in love with the only companion she has, and it seems to be a pretty healthy relationship, so yay? Yet when I look at it deeper, I can't help but feel depressed by their circumstances. If Elster really is destabilizing and having thoughts of Alina, could she be confusing Ariane for the memories of her lover from her Gestalt life? If so, it'd make their relationship a ruse. I mean, they're seemingly happy, but I can't help but feel it's all been built off of a lie. And they've connected over movies, art, and music, things which are strictly forbidden from being shown to Ariane's Elster unit. Why would the Yusin Nation even provide them with all this stuff? She's not supposed to watch war movies, but you stock the ship with the fucking Spielberg box set? What gives? Did they mean for Elster to be destabilized? If so, is the nation responsible for this relationship even having been formed? How far-reaching is its grip that their ideology touches them even all the way out here? And what's the motivation for an Elster to be destabilized intentionally? With the Yusin Nation sending them beyond the Oort cloud at sublight speeds, it seems to me that Elster is being calibrated to eventually euthanize Ariane when the mission ultimately fails. They're happy now, sure, but it's a delusion, and one which unfortunately doesn't last long. As the two embrace and fall asleep in Ariane's bed, 3-note oddity sounds out over the ship's communication systems. Their new orders have arrived, and Elster's memories have returned. An older, steely-eyed Ariane appears over Elster's broken body beyond the threshold, her skin patched with bandages and marked with cuts and blood. A final call to their promise forces Elster's lifeless eyes open. The transformation has concluded, and Elster awakens back on the same snowy planet from the prologue, the same place we first passed the Blackstone Archway, the first place we first stepped down into the first of many holes to find Ariane's room and the King in Yellow. Right. Alright, I figure it's about time we get into it. At the risk of becoming the cosmic horror guy, we gotta talk about this fucking thing. I know I already made mention of Birkeland's Isle of the Dead and its importance in understanding the game's false ending and the relationship between Elster and Ariane, but if we really want to understand, or at least try to understand, what's going on with the rest of the story, and with all the game's surrealism, Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow practically qualifies as required reading. And to clarify, The King in Yellow refers both to the title of Robert W. Chambers' book of short stories and to the title of the fictitious play which appears throughout them. And it's really this book within the book that informs Signalis' story. So to be clear, from this point on, when I'm referring to The King in Yellow, I'll be referring to the fictitious play. And when I discuss the stories within Chambers' book, I'll reference them by name. Not much is known about The King in Yellow. Chambers leaves a lot of mystery around the play and only provides a handful of details. We get a few recurring names and images throughout his stories, which Chambers borrows from writer and American Civil War veteran Ambrose Bierce, but little in the way of concrete fact. From the first story in his collection, The Repairer of Reputations, we're told that it's at least a 2-act play with a rather bland opening. The story's protagonist and narrator, Hildred Castaigne, began reading the book after a fall from his horse, which left him bedridden. Flipping through its pages one night during his recovery period, Hildred grew both bored and disgusted by it, and had flung the book into the fireplace after having read through its first act. Only by catching a glimpse of the words in the second act did he resolve to finish it, fetching the tome from the hot coals and poring over its remaining pages with a feverish obsession, laughing aloud and weeping to himself over countless readings and rereadings. The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterward with more awful effect, which incidentally reflects Signalis' rather bog-standard survival horror mechanics giving way to the supreme note of art the game strikes with its false ending, which I see as paralleling those same seductive first words of Act 2, which drew Hildred back into reading the play, though I wouldn't go so far as to call the first 2 chapters of Signalis boring. We're also told that The King in Yellow is a banned book, as the French government had begun seizing the translated copies as contraband, which is an aspect referenced by the book's inclusion in Ariane's room in the prologue amongst banned Imperial serials. It's also a way for Chambers to tell us just how decadent and controversial The King in Yellow is. French literature at the time of Chambers' writing of his stories was known for being particularly lascivious, with many of the more provocative books being wrapped in a yellow paper to inform readers of their content. Thus, the yellow motif is there to highlight the decadence of the play, as well as the universal condemnation and censorship surrounding it. The book was feared by most of the other characters within Chambers' stories, and had developed a reputation for inducing madness in its readers. Hildred's cousin Louis, for instance, expresses a fear of being driven crazy by the book, referencing the press's denunciation of it and the author's suicide after penning it. And so while the exact contents of The King in Yellow are left vague, it's ultimately understood to contain deeply disturbing, sanity-shattering truths, which irreversibly alter the reader's perception of reality, to the point of blurring the lines between the events and images of the play and the real world. It's possible that Hildred was once still at least partially sane after reading The King in Yellow, but by the time the narration begins, he's completely lost his mind, with the play having overwritten his memories and personality, much like Alina, Falka, and Elster's memories being overwritten by Ariane. The play's reality-bending properties are further explored in The Mask, wherein the protagonist narrator, Alec, is beset by a bout of dreams which incorporate imagery from the play's first act, most notably the pallid mask of the stranger, who is thought to be an avatar of the king within the play. The King in Yellow's powers over dreams are also seen in the Yellow Sign, when one of the character's nightmares comes to life to haunt her at the end of the story. Other elements of Alec's dreams are also made mention of in the Yellow Sign, wherein the painter Mr. Scott and his model Tessie discuss in length scenes from The King in Yellow. They recall the Lake of Holly as if they've personally been there to see it, the dark waters stretched thin and blank, without a ripple or wind to stir it, and the fluttered, scalloped tatters of The King in Yellow, imagery which influences the opening shot of our first trip to the shore in Signalis, the still, black lake centered in the apparent silhouette of the hooded king. This familiarity readers of The King in Yellow develop for the play's imagery stems from The King in Yellow's ability to physically transport them into the play. And so, all of the teleportation Elster has been doing throughout the game, first to Sierpinski, later to the radio station on Rotfront, and pretty much any time she takes a dive down a hole, is caused by the magic of The King in Yellow, which she has been under the influence of ever since finding a copy of the play in the prologue. And when she does so, she forever ties herself and the other Elsters which will come to inherit her memories from Ariane to the play, which is why much of the game has that surrealist, dreamlike quality to its presentation. Things are probably really happening, but they're also heavily influenced by Ariane, the play, and bioresonance. Bioresonance has been mentioned briefly in a few documents we've come across, but like The King in Yellow, we never really get a full explanation of what it is. Certain individuals, like the Falka and Calibri pattern replicas, are stated as being powerful bioresonants, capable of influencing the thoughts of others and the world around them. Notably, these replicas bear a pattern on their forehead, the 3 stars, which are seen throughout the game on various pillars, the Usin Nation's flag, and of course, on the cover of The King in Yellow, suggesting that the play itself is a source of bioresonance. The presence of the 3-star motif throughout the Empire and the Nation implies that the play had a great deal of significance in humanity's development into a starfaring species, providing the Empress, thought to be a very powerful bioresonant herself, with the means to bend reality to her will and usher her subjects into a new era of progress. Despite her apparent control over it and her use of the play in the fast-forwarding of humanity's development, she ultimately committed suicide during her reign, perhaps as a result of being driven mad by the play. What happened to The King in Yellow afterwards remains a mystery. The only sure thing is that, at some point, it must have become tied to Ariane. When exploring Nowhere, Elster can find a note which makes mention of an entity called the Dreamer, who births a new world from their dreams for eternity. It's likely that Ariane is the Dreamer in this case, and whatever eldritch entity exists behind the play is amplifying her ability to overwrite memories and shape reality. This would make Ariane a powerful bioresonant. And so, if Ariane is the Dreamer, then the events of Signalis' story are all a figment of her bioresonant imagination, right? Well, kind of. Much of the game's story and locations do seem to exist in reality. Sierpinski is a real place that had real people working there, and since there's no reason to believe Ariane had ever been there herself, it wouldn't make sense for it to be a figment of her dreams or memories. So then, why would Sierpinski be a fleshy nightmare? Well, we know that the red desert found below the mines had a profound impact on the sanity of Falka and Adler, and that the passing of the threshold preceded the spreading of the flesh throughout Sierpinski, and the note on the beach alluded to the Sea of Flesh's consumption of individuals into a collective entity, much like The King in Yellow subsuming its readers into its narrative. With the flesh acting as a kind of focus, then like The King in Yellow in Chambers' short stories, Ariane is able to influence the real world. Rather unfortunately so if you're a political prisoner picking at hexagons in an otherworldly cavern. Ariane is out in butt-fuck nowhere outer space, but is still able to bring to life her memories and alter the world around her, turning Sierpinski into her waking nightmare. If you've ever played Silent Hill 1, then one way I found helpful to understand the goings-on of Signalis' story was to liken Ariane to Alessa Gillespie. If you haven't played Silent Hill 1, well, I guess you're shit out of luck, but I'll try to explain what I mean. In Silent Hill 1, Alessa Gillespie is the daughter of cult leader and overall shit person Dahlia Gillespie, who set fire to Alessa in a dark ritual. All of the horrors of the town are manifestations of her trauma, and so while Silent Hill is a real place, the monsters living there and the distortions to its streets and buildings are caused by Alessa's psychic influence. In subsequent Silent Hill games, most of the monsters are representative of the protagonist's trauma, but in Silent Hill 1, it can all be tied back to Alessa. So if we apply this logic to Ariane, then the events of Signalis take place in at least semi-real areas, distorted under the influence of Ariane as the dreamer. Thinking of Ariane in this way is important for providing context to many of the game's events. Jumping into TV screens and winding up at the shores of the Lake of Holly are confusing plot points on their own, but with Ariane's bioresonance and the imagery of the King in Yellow in mind, we can chalk a lot of that stuff up to dream logic. But, as I mentioned before, not everything in Signalis is a figment of Ariane's imagination. Sierpinski was very much a real facility which had nothing to do with Ariane at all, at least not until the discovery of the gate underneath the mines and Falca's return from beyond the threshold. Falca was touched by Ariane's mind beyond the gate, which pulled her and the other inhabitants of the facility under Ariane's influence. So while the cycles turned and Ariane and the flesh slowly invaded Sierpinski, from the perspective of the inhabitants, the horror was inexplicable and otherworldly. They simply dug too deep and uncovered an artifact of eldritch mystery, and the King in Yellow, the Dreamer, and the infection all stemmed from it. In a far too reductive nutshell, it's Silent Hill 1 meets cosmic horror. As the cycles proceeded, Ariane would continue to transport any Elster units which responded to her signal to Sierpinski, which we know to be at least several dozen from Adler's body count. Looks like a handful of Elsters got close, but either gave up or succumbed to the wastes before finding Ariane. There's also an implied bit of meta-storytelling here, with each of the player's deaths in subsequent playthroughs picking up in one of the countless iterations of Ariane's dream as another Elster unit. Eventually, an Elster does manage to make their way to the Penrose and find Ariane, which brings us back to our Elster beyond the threshold. At this point, she is fully overwritten by Ariane in the play, acting out the role of Ariane's Elster whom she now fully identifies with. It's one last bit of existential horror in the sea of the cosmic. The complete consumption of Elster's identity by Ariane's psychic will leaves nothing of our original Elster left. There's been a lot of hive mind horror and dystopian groupthink in the background of Signalis, but the literal blending of Elster's I into a we has gotta be one of the most blatant and potent plays on the theme of selfhood the game employs. Our original Elster is gone. We control the same body as before, but her mind is that of Ariane's Elster. Driven by her promise, she drags herself through the snow back inside the Penrose, limping through its wreckage on the brink of death. A bloodied note written in Ariane's hand tells of tragedy. An illness had taken hold of her, causing hair loss, insomnia, sore gums, and missing teeth. The flesh and its infection still clings to this place, enveloping Ariane's cryopod and consuming the interior of the room with veins and muscle fibers which spread tendril-like over the floor and up to the ceiling. Elster fully remembers the promise she made with Ariane, and is determined to keep it. She scavenges the body of another Elster unit in order to repair her damaged chassis, and sets off into the Penrose. As if seeing her resolve and reaching out one final time, the same note, now steeped in crimson, as if the page itself bleeds, begs Elster to make the pain stop. The front of the ship is overgrown with the writhing flesh, beckoning us downwards into its embrace yet again. Our fall takes us back to the shores of oblivion. In a pool of blood, a final note pleads for release in desperate and mad ravings. A promise must be fulfilled. A promise to kill Ariane and release her from this suffering. The ferry waits on the shore to take us to the Isle of the Dead. Seems Elster holds the oars after all. Chapter 3. Gestaltzerfall. The decomposition of the shape. The breaking down of the complex into its constituting parts. Everything is clear now. Once more, we begin in the bathroom at S23 Sierpinski, the flesh slowly consuming the facility, and the moths, a symbol of transformation, rapidly multiplying. The layout is much the same as the first time around, minus all the flesh. All of the old documents and posters can still be found in the same spots, but they're heavily faded, as if the flesh is actively working its way through this place and consuming it until no trace nor detail of its original likeness remains. The end of I, and the beginning of we. The only uncorrupted poster I can find is in the classroom. Ironically, a propaganda piece promoting the idea of the collective. In the same room, a note is left on the chalkboard from an Elster of a previous cycle. You've been here before. Just in case we haven't put it together yet. Using the same safe code as before, we grab up the classroom key and head north, before reaching the final meaty chasm. And wherever this descent takes us, Adler has followed suit. Though his relationship with Falca mirrors that of Elster's with Ariane, something about his becoming whole is more sinister. It's as if he has a knowledge of the workings of the flesh and the dreamer. In an allusion to Chambers' The Mask, Adler quotes Act 1, Scene 2 from The King in Yellow, suggesting that he has been overwritten by the play to serve as the stranger, the king's avatar. Elsewhere, the flesh's influence can be seen in the hand of an infected Issa. She too is trapped in this hell by her encounter with the book, which was shown briefly in the prologue. These characters have all been brought together by the Dreamer and the King in Yellow, ushered into the final act, Rotfront. Unlike Sierpinski, this final area is entirely of Ariane's creation, having been modeled off of the Sector C apartment complex she lived in with her aunt Camilla. Initially, when Ariane moved to the city, she didn't know anybody, and she was bullied by her classmates for her differing interests and appearance. The beating she took would ultimately send Ariane to the hospital with severe bruising. And while Issa did little to help in that initial encounter, her twin sister Erica would stick up for Ariane in future, forging a friendship between the three of them as a result. They'd spend time together after class in the bookstore the Ito sisters' parents owned, which was where Ariane was first exposed to the King in Yellow, and another book titled Song of the Gods, which metaphorically describes bioresonance as the song of the universe that we all dance to. The book makes mention of gifted individuals who are capable of tuning into the sound of this song, not only able to hear and play the metaphorical notes, but conduct the orchestra which shapes reality. The Ito twins are also the first to introduce Ariane to Alina Sieđ, shown in this photograph standing alongside the Venettan soldier from the False Ending. The roster of the 5th Venettan Infantry Division lists several names, with Lilith Ito standing out from the rest as a likely relative of the twins. And so if there's any reason that they would have such a photograph, it would be because it depicts Alina Sieđ alongside Lilith Ito, making this woman Elster's original Gestalt. During their time on Veneta, Lilith and Alina developed a relationship together, which ended in tragedy when all but 2 of the 5th Infantry Division's members were killed in action. Lilith Ito, shown in the False Ending leaving white lilies on Alina's grave, and Rebecca Liang, who is listed as working as a biologist after the war by a medical database accessible in Rotfront's clinic. This means that the notes we find from Alina throughout the game were all fabrications. She was never at Sierpinski, and Elster spent the first half of the game looking for a dead person. Her presence was strong earlier on as a result of Elster's resurfacing Gestalt memories, which caused her to see Alina before she had begun to be overwritten by Ariane. Ariane had Alina in mind because she was personally affected by Alina's physical resemblance towards her, and she began fantasizing about Alina's life as a soldier far from the confines of Rotfront. See, Ariane had always been a creative and emotional person, focusing her attention on art, music, and literature as opposed to hobbies deemed more normal by the state. A teacher's evaluation of Ariane makes direct mention of her upbringing, her hobbies, and her friendship with the Ito twins, stressing her inability to conform and recommending compulsory military service as a way to beat those ideas out of her. In a desire to escape, Ariane applied for membership within the Penrose program. Incidentally, if she was rejected, she was to end up serving in the work camp at Sierpinski. So a lot of the horror we come across at the start of the game is a result of Ariane's anxieties and imaginations of just how horrible such a place would be to live. And boy, she was definitely right about that. That place fucking sucked. Sometime later, her bioresonant potential would be discovered by the school's administration, and a series of tests were conducted in order to determine the level of her abilities. One test took the form of a tarot card reading, the same test Adler made mention of in his diary, confirming that he met Ariane in his Gestalt life. This tarot card test serves as one of the 2 major puzzles in Sector C. Each card can be found throughout the level, and with each card gained, Sector C grows more and more corrupted, the flesh spreading like a cancer and blocking off previously accessible doors. The most notable of the tarot cards is the Arcana of Death. Inside the Ito bookstore, Elster finds Isa by herself, defeated by her inability to find Erica. As she reaches out to Elster, her body rapidly degenerates, the flesh consuming her and melting her away into a bloody mass of worms. A final plea for forgiveness is all that remains. Inside the store, 2 portraits for the Ito twins can be seen on a shrine where the death card sits, suggesting that both Erica and Isa have been dead for some time, and the Isa we've been encountering has been a figment of Ariane's memories. Isa must have been pulled into Ariane's dream by her association with the King in Yellow, which she used to conduct some sort of ritual in the prologue. Isa began the ritual to find her sister, and by entering the play, she actually died in reality. And so when Isa comes across her own shrine in Ariane's reconstruction of Sector C, she realizes that she has been dead the entire time, and collapses into non-existence. It's very reminiscent of Ambrose Bierce's short story, An Inhabitant of Carcosa, wherein the ghost of the narrator wanders through the titular city's ruins before finding his own grave. Still, even going that route, Isa remains an incredibly mysterious character, and her twin sister Erica even more so. It might be cheating, but again, I have to lean on Silent Hill for this one. I mean, this cutscene is so similar to Lisa Garland's death that it feels like they lifted it right out of the game. I could just be talking complete ass, and I know it's super reductive, but just go play Silent Hill 1, it'll make more sense. Anyways, with the death card in hand and the other tarot cards collected, we can head back up to the examination room. On the table, there are 6 positions which correspond to the 6 planets of the solar system. Nearby, a dream diary details a series of images associated with a particular planet and arcana. Beyond just providing the answers to the puzzle, the dream diary gives us a brief glimpse into the terror of the incident at Sierpinski. The entry corresponding to Death and the 13th Night recounts the dream of a mine worker who had been consumed by the flesh during the incident. The final line suggests that the flesh is made up of all the people who were consumed by it, their minds becoming one with the collective, subsumed by the King in Yellow, and further strengthening the link between the flesh on Lang to the events of the game and Ariane's dreams. After placing the tarot cards and flicking the switch on the black light, the phases of the moon are revealed, which allows Elster to set the correct combination on the dial puzzle in the central starting room, opening up the hole in the wall and allowing us to crawl through just as we did in the prologue, leading us back to Ariane's room. The King in Yellow rests on the table where we found it originally, only now its 6 seals have been broken. Elster makes a few different comments regarding the items in the room as well, showing just how much she's changed since the start of the game. Hey, there's that weird safe again. When we're ready to go home, we can pick up the King in Yellow and pass through the door. It leads into Ariane's Aunt Camilla's home, and the final save room of the game, symbolic of it being the last place Ariane spent the night before leaving for her service in the Penrose program. It's simultaneously a place of comfort and disappointment. It was a place she could call home, sure, but the notes from the government would remind her that it was only temporary, and the letters from her mother would serve to remind her of the home she wished she could go back to. The whole scene is haunted by the piercing red light of the television, which illuminates our exit from this melancholy refuge towards the end of our journey. Beyond the door, a great steel bridge stretches over an unfathomable darkness, each of Elster's determined steps against the metal grating echoing out into the unknown. The path is littered with notes, the first penned by Adler. He writes of his despair over the infection, which he has come to understand not as an ailment of the body or mind, but of reality itself, a corrupting force which slowly twists the world with each passing cycle, until only the flesh remains. Another scrap of paper rests on the wayside near the end of the hall, a final plea from Adler, urging us to stop. With each turn of the cycle, the world has sunk further into the chaos of the flesh, and Elster's continued advance threatens to take away the few scraps of his life he can still call his own. By this point, Adler wants nothing more than to covet Falca's presence. Elster's conviction is at odds with his obsession. Now, in the end of all things, with a full grasp of the cycles and what's at stake, he wants nothing more than to be alone with Falca forever. It's pathetic and pitiable, really. Adler's progression throughout the cycles can be read through firsthand if we turn back to the game's final save room, which now leads us into a secret area, placing us back in Adler's disordered study. Much like our first visit, his diary can be found on the desk nearby, and it contains all the same stuff we saw previously. But unlike our first visit, there are several additional documents strewn about his room. 2 alternate copies of his diary contain entries from previous cycles. They paint a picture of a more ordinary time at Sierpinski, before the discovery of the gate below Leng and Falka's illness. In the first diary, Adler seems to be living an ordinary life, filling out paperwork and attending meetings while people-watching and writing about his failed cooking endeavors. All in all, seemed like a pretty regular, boring guy. This diary makes mention of his ordering of an Elster unit, which arrived at Sierpinski and began working as an engineer down in the mines. There's a roster sheet in this same office which lists an LSTR S2301 as part of the excavation team, and a document containing details on the LSTR replica pattern. The biggest revelation from this document lies in the final sentence. It states that the original neural pattern for the Elster replicas was lost with the destruction of the Central Neural Archive on Veneta, and that all new Elster units since then have been produced based on a decommissioned unit from the Penrose program. This means the Elster we assume control of in Chapter 1 was a figment of LSTR S2301, whose already degraded persona was a result of being based off of Ariane's war movie classical music exposed Elster. And when we stepped beyond the threshold, Adler's LSTR S2301 came to remember her life as Ariane's LSTR 512. In the subsequent diary entries, LSTR S2301 never arrived at Sierpinski, due to Falka's illness delaying their requisition. Still, Adler retained memories of that first Elster unit, which upset his bioresonant Calibri co-worker, who probed his mind and found memories of a replica which, from her perspective, never existed. This is why all those other replicas we come across are shocked to see us, and why Adler recognizes us from previous cycles before hitting us with the Leonidas special. As the cycles progressed, he would retain these early memories, all the while dreaming of his Gestalt life in greater and greater detail. It's possible other replicas would have come to understand the truth as Adler did, but of course, most of them died or succumbed to the infection before that, and so Adler was left alone as Sierpinski went to shit, dreams of his past resurfacing and memories of previous cycles warping his sense of time and judgment. It's a big part of why I can't really fully hate the guy. He's a victim in all this too. His struggle clearly mirrors Elster's own, and like her, most of his previous self has been torn away from him. The only identity he has left is intertwined with Falka. Signalis really says a lot about what grief can do to a person, and how the inability to move on from the loss of a loved one can completely drain the soul and substance from an individual. Adler is almost completely defined by what's left his life empty, rather than what remains to fulfill it. Really, by this point, both Elster and Adler don't have a self to call their own. They almost entirely identify themselves relative to their respective idols. You could argue that Elster's obsessions are more justified due to her love for Ariane, but is there any doubt at this point that Adler wants nothing more than to see his beloved leader open her eyes? And what makes it so tragic is that there's nothing left of her. Whatever Falka Adler came to admire at Sierpinski is long dead. Her memories are now those of Elster's. She remembers those corny war movies like she was there for them, with Ariane snuggled tightly under her arm. But those memories don't belong to her. They belong to Elster, and we're here to take them back. Returning to the end of the bridge, we head towards Falka's bedroom, and with one last look at the Isle of the Dead and the shores of Oblivion, towards our final encounter. Falka meets us with cold recognition before rising from her bed and taking up her weapons. In contrast to Elster's determination, Falka has succumbed to hopelessness, gripped by feelings of abandonment. To her, there is nothing left to do but wait for the embrace of death. She opens her eyes and we take one last look at her pallid beauty before the corrupted goddess takes shape. When beckoning us to join together, we no longer know if it is Falka or the flesh which speaks to us. The fight kicks off with Falka looming above the crimson coffin which was once her bed. She hurls her golden spears at Elster as the two battle it out in the endless expanse of blood and sinew. Her bioresonant shrieks distort Elster's systems, which flash a conflicted medley of threats to her life while pleading for release. There's even some Bible verses thrown in for extra dramatic oomph. After taking enough damage, Falka will drop to the ground, giving Elster an opening to return one of those psychic skewers to sender. Each successful spearing advances the battle, as the two weave through the game's prior set pieces before ultimately ending the showdown in a featureless void. At this point, Falka raises several barriers to deflect Elster's shots, and hits our own screen with so much static it's almost impossible to see what we're doing. Once we've got her looking like Boromir, we rush through her shielding to deal the killing stroke. As the blood streams down Falca's face, Elster is flooded with the missing memories of her final days on the Penrose after that fateful anniversary dance. She recalls sharing an embrace with an older Ariane, alone in the vastness of space, with only each other and the stars as witness. They made their promise. An oath taken must be fulfilled. Again, the Isle beckons, mixed with imagery from Falca's own past. From the two, a completed Elster 512 takes shape. With a hand upon Elster's breast, Falca surrenders her mind to her. Now, they are one. She's waited a long time for this reunion. It seems she really will get to meet the white-haired girl after all, in a way. Once again, we return to the threshold. Adler stands atop the rise, taunting and jeering as we move towards the end with stalwart strides. A pity the man, now taken by the flesh, cannot see that he denies the spirit of his love her only desire. All he has left is to cling to this crumbling world, and to act upon his hatred of all who dare to take it from him. But left bleeding on the steps, able only to mutter a final pathetic curse as we pass by, the last glimpse of Adler is one of a man fully consumed by the flesh, mutated without sight or spirit of his past self. Blood seeping from her eye, Elster paces through the crimson sands and returns to the wreck of the Penrose one more time. We've come back. Refuse and ruin litters the innards of the colossal wreckage. Clutching her side in pain, Elster moves to the northern door and enters the central accessway of the Penrose. The ship is full of notes from Ariane, which progress through the cycles and give us a glimpse into the young woman's life. The journey began with optimism. Ariane saw the Penrose as a place where she could finally be herself, and do what she loved without persecution. As their voyage continued, Ariane grew lonelier, with only Elster to keep her company. As time went on, the two would become friends and, ultimately, lovers. On the night of their 3,000 cycle anniversary, the two would receive their final orders. Having not found a new world, and with Elster and the ship reaching the end of their operational life cycles, the reality of the final phase of their mission was revealed. The Penrose program was not but a death sentence. With rations running low and the ship's reactor leaking radiation, the only order Ariane had left to fulfill was to die for the glory of the Usan nation, either by allowing Elster to euthanize her, or by taking permanent rest within the ship's cryopod. The two had only just begun to fall for one another before their realization that their fate was sealed 3,000 cycles prior. There was never enough time. To receive such news on the eve of what should have been a happy and tender night with her lover drove Ariane to despair. The three-note oddity which accompanied the transmission was like a herald of her doom, and the dread and anxiety it produced within her is why it's such a recurring motif of Ariane's waking dream, which really at this point is more a nightmare than anything else. North of the briefing room, the damaged reactor core spews noxious radiation from its crippled shell. The poison seeped into the ship, slowly killing Ariane. Hair loss, fatigue, and insomnia plagued her every day and night, and a deep, numbing depression took hold of her. Like the flesh spreading throughout Sector C, Ariane was succumbing to cancer. Yet, in defiance of their orders, Elster and Ariane continued to cling to one another, buying as much time as they could by placing Ariane within the cryopod for extended periods of time between brief and hazy waking moments together. But there was never any hope of survival. Each night could have been either woman's last, and though Ariane feared for her final goodnight to Elster, it would be the young Gestalt pilot who was left dreaming alone in open space. Ariane's bedroom, still bearing the scattered ration boxes and hanging decorations of their happy night together, would become Elster's final resting place after her body succumbed to illness. Placing Ariane in the cryopod for another night's rest, Elster spent her last few moments in this room, reminiscing on their time together as her replica body failed her. Though she made a promise to Ariane, at the end of all things, she couldn't keep it. It had to end this way, with Elster's empty shell at the foot of Ariane's bed, the distant sounding of the music, the sonorous ghost of their dancing joy the only company her remains now keep. For our original Elster, And for Ariane, we've come home to fulfill this promise. Elster steps cautiously to the side of the cryopod at the center of the room, where Ariane lays dreaming. Mirroring Adler's affection for Falka, Elster bends a knee and kisses her on the forehead, her heart pounding as Ariane slowly awakens after countless cycles of tormented sleep. But those placid crimson eyes betray a heartbreaking truth. There is no recognition in her gaze. Elster. Ariane has forgotten the name. After all of that, all of our love, all of our hate, all of our memory, it was all for nothing. Our struggle was meaningless. Elster's remembered who she was, but Ariane is Ariane no longer. Even if we could fulfill our promise now, it wouldn't matter, because the woman we made that promise to is gone. Perhaps this really is hell. As the blood seeps from her eye and her body grows weak, Elster pleads to spend the last few moments she has left by her lover's side, if only for the comfort her presence gives her. One last moment together before the end. The two are left to lay there, doomed to suffer through another cycle. And god damn it if that ain't the most brutal shit I've seen in a while. To go through all of that struggle and rediscovery of the self, only to be forgotten by the object of our affection, is soul-crushing. The Elster we began the game with was completely overwritten for the purpose of seeking out Ariane and fulfilling their promise. Her entire reason for existence was oriented towards that singular goal. And here, at the end, when she finally lays her eyes upon her, Ariane treats her like a stranger. Worse still, with Elster unable to bring herself to kill Ariane, the cycle will be doomed to repeat. The influence of the flesh will grow, the world around them will continue to decay, and countless other Elsters will be doomed to follow the same path towards failure. The only thing to come of our journey is the leaving behind of our body for spare parts, for when the next Elster comes through, limbless and broken, and unaware of the disappointment awaiting her. Is this really how it's meant to go on? Forever? Like this? When I first completed the game on Survivor mode, this is how Signalis panned out for me. The memory ending. But there are two other endings which you can get after defeating Falka, determined by several statistics throughout your playthrough, such as damage taken, time to beat the game, enemies defeated, and time spent healing. Some of these factors are pretty arbitrary though, like NPCs spoken to or how many times you checked doors. It's yet another thing Signalis borrows from the Silent Hill series, which, personally, I could do without. It makes gunning for a particular ending a pain in the ass if you want to see more of what the story has to offer, or if you've spent the last 2 months working on a video and need some fucking footage for the ending. Don't get me wrong, it's a cool idea in theory, as it should hit you with an ending which matches your playstyle. If your Elster was finding herself lost in memories, stalling for time by talking to NPCs, and running away for most of her battles, then you'll likely end up with the Leave ending, in which Elster reaches the Penrose and goes to meet with Ariane, but ultimately can't bring herself to see her, leaving their promise unfulfilled as she walks out into the wastes and lays down to cry herself to death. But how and why those factors are meant to reflect a hesitant Elster is a little bit debatable if you ask me. Oh, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm being a bit dismissive of Leave. The Leave ending is, to me, Signalis' bad ending, both in the sense that you got the worst outcome possible, and that it's just not a very satisfying conclusion to the story, in my opinion. I understand the angle of the tragedy they were going for with Elster being too weak to go on, but it pales in comparison to the absolute gut punch of the memory ending, and Ariane not recognizing Elster after she's resolved to fulfill their promise. There's some parallels to draw between Adler's obsession over Falka and Elster's inability to go through with killing Ariane, but the imagery for such a comparison is more blatant in memory anyway. Still, it's a vital piece of the story, especially when you conceptualize Signalis' multiple endings as different iterations of the cycle. The Leave ending can be seen as the conclusion to a typical first playthrough, an Elster who is unsure of herself and ultimately fails to achieve her goal. In a subsequent playthrough and cycle, Elster and the player know more about the story, which paths to take through the game, and how to avoid taking too much damage. She ultimately reaches Ariane, but cannot fulfill her promise because Ariane can't remember it. The Elster of this cycle dies by the cryopod, leaving her armor plating for a third playthrough, wherein the gloves come off and Elster rip and tears her way through Sierpinski, Nowhere, and Rotfront in order to rack up the kill count required for what I consider to be Signalis' definitive ending. Much of the Promise ending plays out the same way Memory did, though the music has a much deeper and more ominous drone to it. As Elster kneels down and kisses Ariane, few words are exchanged between the two. This isn't a happy reunion. Ariane lies awake in the pod, numb to the countless cycles she's spent trapped within it. Elster struggles to bring herself to harm Ariane, but she pleads with her to bring this nightmare to an end. Ariane lays a gentle hand upon Elster's, telling her it's okay. Her vision fades. Her eyes roll over. Thank you. Elster stands to move away from her, but crashes to the floor. She lays aside her best friend and loved one with a faint smile on her lips. Death embraces her. The light leaves her eye, and we leave our two oath-bound souls to their shared, tragic fate. The Promise ending feels like the culmination of Signalis' story. While the previous two endings each leave threads unresolved, with the Promise ending and Ariane's death, the cycle should cease. The final shot on Elster's eye parallels the one from the false ending, providing some closure to the story. It's about as close to a good ending as one can expect to get out of Signalis. As the great Victor Hugo once put it, melancholy is the happiness of being sad, and that's kinda how I feel at the end of all this tragedy. I wish they could find a way to be happy, but really, this is probably the best fate for the two of them. Ariane's suffering can finally end. But wait, what's stopping me from starting up a new game? This whole meta-narrative cycle element kind of breaks down when you can just play through the game a 4th or 5th or 9th time and get one of the other endings all over again. Am I reading into it too literally, or is there something else that Signalis is hiding from me? Surprise! It's both! Those cheeky fucks did it again. Alright, it might not be a total fake-out ending, but Leave, Memory, and Promise are not the only endings in Signalis. There's a secret 4th ending which can only be reached after playing through the game at least one time, which not only means the developers expected players to repeat the cycle, but that Promise isn't actually the end after all. Killing Ariane fails to do anything. The two really are in an inescapable cosmic horror. A nightmare with an eldritch reality to it, which only becomes more apparent in our pursuit of the artifact ending. The background behind the artifact ending and the Signalis community's quest to find it is pretty incredible. Essentially, in order to reach this ending, we're going to need to acquire 3 separate keys, but the locations of these keys are completely hidden from us within the game. There's no notes, no images or bits of dialogue, or clues of any kind to be found throughout Signalis' levels. 2 days after Signalis' release, Reddit user SSZZ127 posted an image to the Signalis subreddit, which they generated from one of the game's radio frequencies using third-party software. The image shows a CCTV capture of the back room of the Ito bookstore. Following this discovery, SSZZ127 and other Signalis players began running through the other frequencies, producing a set of 3 images in total. Each of these images is a clue to the location of one of the keys. The Key of Love being found by one of the cages in the nurses' rooms, the Key of Eternity by the painting of Saturn chowing down on his son, and the Key of Sacrifice by the back shelf of the Ito bookstore. It's a truly inspired bit of metafiction Rose Engine incorporated into their game, effectively requiring players to become code breakers if they want to avoid cluelessly clicking on every square inch of pixel in the game. It also further leans into the meta-narrative elements of Signalis' cycle. It's not just you as a singular player. Every single person who bought the game, across all of their deaths and playthroughs, has embodied Elster, uncovering the artifact ending through their collective knowledge. And again, 2 days in, and this big brain gamer decided to run the frequencies through MMSS TV and see what happens, effectively cracking open the game's biggest mystery and kicking off a chain of puzzle solving and data mining which continues to this day. Wherever you are, SSZZ127, I salute you. It's because of you and other passionate fans that smooth-brained Andes like myself were able to acquire the keys and bring them to the safe in the bottom right corner of Ariane's room. With the padlocks removed, the safe's number pad can be accessed. It requires the 20-digit code we've heard from the 3-note oddity throughout the game. 3-note oddity was a real-life number station believed to be operated by Hungarian intelligence until it became inactive in 2005, which I guess means Signalis is also an alternate reality game, at least in part. The recording was later released as part of the Conant project and can be found on YouTube. It's a bit grainy and tough to hear, and of course the numbers are all read out in German, but I have Rammstein to thank for teaching me to count to 10. Once open, the safe's contents are revealed. Potted white lilies, taken from Ariane's mother's home and kept safe after she moved to her aunt's. At least, metaphorically, I don't know if they'd survive in there for long. Elster takes the white lilies from the safe, and in an image reminiscent of her Gestalt's past, places them upon an altar. She falls to the ground at the foot of the pillar, joined by 6 additional Elsters, symbolizing the players and the community's efforts to reach this point. At the center lies a scintillating artifact, which matches the imagery of the game's logo and ritual circles. Above the penrose, a great red eye gazes upon the barren wastes. In its vision, it conjures a dream, an eternal dance between our armored Elster and her sickly Ariane. The two are finally together, in eternity. The artifact ending leaves me pretty conflicted. On the one hand, it could be seen as the happy reunion Elster and Ariane always wanted. On the other, it's a delusion, conjured by a grief-stricken Elster unable to let go of Ariane's death. The text which flashes on screen is taken from the Book of Revelation 9:6, which describes the punishment of unbelievers as brutal and unbearable, yet inescapable, even as the sufferers seek the release of death. The breaking of the 6 seals, which are so prominent throughout the game, also correspond to this biblical apocalyptic imagery. Has Elster doomed herself and others over her selfish desire to see Ariane again? Even if they are together now, it'll never be real. All she's really achieved is the coveting of her desires, a goal we demonized Adler for earlier for even pursuing. Through this lens, the artifact ending can be seen as the most grim of the 4. The two will remain locked in perpetual agony, with only the illusion of each other for their cold comfort as the world around them crumbles into ruin. Still, I like to think this ending is more cheerful. I mean, I've been through way too much getting to this point. Seriously, this game made me cry like 9 times going over the footage, so even if it's copium, I want the two to be happy. From a different approach, the artifact ending can be read into as an expression of Elster coming to terms with her and Ariane's deaths. By letting go of the cycles and rejecting the king by taking up the lilies in place of the play, Elster finally achieves peace, and accepts that nothing will bring her beloved Ariane back to her. It's the same letting go of the past which has kept Adler so hung up the entire game. And since he's such a clear foil to Elster's character, her acceptance of her own and Ariane's deaths shows that she's overcome the burden of her guilt and grief after countless cycles through purgatory. Taking this approach, the cycle wasn't being perpetuated by Ariane at all. It was being perpetuated by Elster, who through her inability to let go of her grief and their promise, continued to walk the same paths through the King in Yellow. Ariane wasn't guiding her to kill her, she was guiding her to the lilies, to closure, in order for her to move on and set them both free. The white lilies themselves are heavily symbolic of this idea, as they represent purity and rebirth, the cleansing of the nightmare and the letting go of the past, and the moving on of both women into the afterlife together. Gone from this material plane and into the great song which binds the universe together as dancers to its music. Often chosen for both weddings and funerals, the lilies seem really emblematic of this final moment they share together, which itself can be seen as a marriage beyond death. The white lilies are also featured prominently in Robert W. Chambers' The Mask, wherein the narrator Alec, having thought his lover to be dead, returns to her petrified body and finds her reborn and renewed before the two embrace. You could really go either way with the artifact ending. It's either a touching and happy one, or the worst and most depressing of the lot. And that's the beauty of Signalis. Everything is so up to interpretation, and the game's many clues and mystery elements leave fans like myself Pepe Sylviaing through the late night hours. But really, none of that is needed to enjoy the game. It's an expressionist piece of art first and foremost, and the focus should be on the feelings it evokes from the player more so than trying to find a concrete outline of the plot. Because, let's face it, There isn't one, and Rose Engine is never going to come out and flat out tell us, and all of our speculation about repetitive sixes and parallel imagery could just be a simple case of pareidolia, an imposing of meaning on the ambiguous. As with any piece of art, it's simultaneously the most alluring and most frustrating aspect of Signalis. We hunger for the knowledge of the truth, but I think a full breakdown of the game's plot by its developers would spoil the magic a little bit. This way, everyone gets to have their own journey through it, and take away their own thoughts and emotions. I hope my thoughts and emotions in this examination of the game weren't too disorganized. This script took a long time to put together, and even longer to try and edit down, if I even managed to do that properly. I've got like 30 pages from the cutting room floor in a separate doc. This shit consume my life. I'm having difficulty believing it's over right now. I'm having difficulty stopping, but I have to. It's just so dense. When you start writing a script and see some tarot cards or a literary reference and you go, oh fuck, I gotta mention that, and pretty soon you end up spending an afternoon writing enough side crap for a totally separate video and adding more and more pages to the script, like fuck. It's also such an intimidating game with very lofty themes, and I'm definitely quite nervous about whether or not I've done it justice. Still, I can say with certainty that Signalis impacted me like few games ever have, and it would be wrong of me to ignore my passion for it just because the subject is more complex. As I said before, with all things in life, even if there is no meaning, or we're completely wrong about what that meaning is, the beauty lies in the pursuit. And Signalis led me down a chase for answers and closure, which has stuck with me over a year after I first played it, only to now be dragged back in when I began working on this video and went back to it for a few more run-throughs. It's been a long time in the making, so yeah. Sorry if this one took a while. I mean, it's not like I've got a release schedule or anything. There's 3 videos on this channel at the time of writing this, but I'm hoping to keep a semi-consistent schedule with new content going forward, at least as far as I'm able to do so without burning out. If you liked what you saw here today and aren't too jaded by it not being a Termina video, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. The game can generate so much discussion, and I just know I've drawn both the attention and ire of several Signalis fans with this one, so I'd love to read what you have to say. I may not end up replying to every comment I get, a lesson I learned with the rather shocking reception to the previous video, but I do read all of them. Thanks again for watching and engaging. I really do appreciate it. Cheers, and see you in the next one.